On September 5, 1978, US President Jimmy Carter, who was apparently very much concerned about world peace and security, invited the two sides of a long-standing conflict to a meeting. Egyptian President and former revolutionary figure Anwar Sadat and Israeli Prime Minister Menachem Begin. After 30 years of fruitless conflict between Arabs and Israel, the two sides finally decided to sit down for days-long secret talks. And of course, secret talks would need a cozy corner in Washington, the Northwestern Road, over the forest hills, where the private resort of the American president is located, Camp David. A spot which is not just about pleasant weather and beautiful scenery and trees. It holds top political secrets. It was not the first time, though, the United States would show its sense of responsibility regarding Israel. That sentiment was shared by all American politicians. The first and probably the most committed American leader with regards to the Middle East conflict was Harry Truman. The best place to demonstrate such a commitment was the United Nations meeting on partitioning Palestine into two Muslim and Jewish territories, a session in which a consensus vote could create a new nation and grant them land.
Those who are in favor will say yes, those who are against will say no.
Afghanistan, no. Argentina, abstention. Egypt, no. Iraq, no. Lebanon, no. Soviet Union, yes.
The United Kingdom, abstain. The United States, yes. Uruguay, yes. The resolution of the DUC Committee for Palestine was adopted by 33 votes, 13 against, 10 abstentions.
Following this meeting, the Israeli flag was hoisted at the United Nations headquarters in New York. With the United Nations dividing Palestine, the Zionists did not keep the major powers much in the waiting. In almost no time, the UN Security Council members sat down to listen to what they had sought from the representative of the UN's Jewish Agency for Palestine.
Not later than May 16th next, a provisional Jewish government will commence to function in cooperation with the representatives of the United Nations then in Palestine.
However, the initial reaction from the White House was in total contrast to the Zionists' expectation. Things did not sound good at all.
The U.S. State Department argued against it. Their first response was, no country, no state.
That's why Israel sent its envoy, Moshe Sharet, to Washington for negotiations in an effort to convince a tough Secretary of State to recognize Israel. But George Marshall wouldn't simply listen. He went to the White House for consultations with President Truman. That's where he found out that the boss did not hold the same stance and that he had different plans for Israel. The president's advisor, Clark Clifford, also attended the meeting.
General Marshall started off. The president listened attentively, and then said, I would like now to hear from Clark. But as I spoke, I saw Marshall's face getting redder and redder.
Marshall realized that Truman's support for the Israelis was rooted in his need for Jewish campaign donations in the upcoming presidential election. Marshall was straightforward about this. He did his best to make Truman understand the consequences of his decision at the international level.
We are in the midst of a very critical situation. We should therefore carefully avoid approaching international problems on an emotional basis.
As a result, Marshall warned that if Truman recognizes Israel, he would not endorse the president in the vote. However, 2 days later, on May 14, 1948, the National Jewish Council members convened in the Tel Aviv Museum to proclaim the formation of an independent Jewish state.
זוהי זכותו הטבעית של העם היהודי להיות ככל עם ועם עומד ברשות עצמו במדינתו הריבונית אשר תפתח לרווחה את שערי המולדת לכל יהודי ותעניק לעם היהודי מעמד של אומה שוות זכויות בתוך העמים. ועל יסוד החלטת עשרת האומות המאוחדות אנו מכריזים בזאת על הקמת מדינה יהודית בארץ ישראל, היא מדינת ישראל.
Only a few days ahead of the announcement, Eliyahu Epstein, the representative of the Provisional Government of Israel and the chairman of the Washington-based Jewish Agency of Palestine, addressed the US president in a letter, saying, "The declaration of Israel's independence will become effective 1 minute after 6 o'clock on May 14, 1948, Washington time. With full knowledge of the deep bond of sympathy which has existed and has been strengthened over the past 30 years between the government of the United States and Jewish people of Palestine, I have been authorized by the provisional government of the new state to tender this message and to express the hope that your government will recognize and will welcome Israel into the community of nations. Very respectfully yours, Eliyahu Epstein, Agent, Provisional Government of Israel." Despite all the opposition expressed by George Marshall, a few hours after the Declaration of Independence and only 11 minutes after 6 p.m., Harry Truman wrote to the UN General Assembly,
This government has been informed that a Jewish state has been proclaimed in Palestine and recognition has been requested by the provisional government thereof. The United States recognizes the provisional government as the de facto authority of the new state of Israel.
One day after Ben-Gurion read out the Declaration of Independence at the Tel Aviv Museum, Egypt, Jordan, Iraq, Lebanon and Syria, all infuriated by the new unwelcome neighbor, invaded Israel. The fledgling country was not well equipped, no tanks and no warplanes. while the Arabs had the upper hand, both in the troop size and the warfare, making their victory seem to be definite. And that happened indeed initially. The Arabs made significant gains as the Zionists were watching the new Jewish land being nipped in the bud. They started a global campaign to purchase arms, a demand to which former Czechoslovakia and the Soviet Union agreed to respond. Weapons from the Eastern Bloc changed the calculations on the ground in the battlefield. The Zionists therefore managed to show off their might to the Arabs, who had entered the battle with too much optimism, using only part of their power, but now moving towards failure. Under pressure from Washington, the United Nations decided to intervene to end the hostilities between the Arabs and the Israelis, and began to force the latter into signing a ceasefire deal, which was announced to end 9 months of futile fighting. The Arabs, however, refused to sign a peace treaty with Israel, which would mean recognizing the Jewish state. Therefore, what they agreed upon did not go beyond a ceasefire. The next Arab-Israeli war broke out over a canal which had been set up in Egypt in 1869, connecting Port Said in the Mediterranean to the Gulf of Suez in the Red Sea, and came to be known later as the Suez Canal, serving as a maritime shortcut for vessels from the Western Hemisphere traveling to the east, so that they didn't have to sail across Africa. For years, the British had been running the Universal Suez Ship Canal Company. However, during a heated speech in the port city of Alexandria on the 26th of July 1956, the new Egyptian president, Gamal Abdel Nasser, declared the Suez Canal nationalized and raised his country's flag as a message of defiance, freezing all the assets of the company, the bulk of which belonged to the British and the French. Already enraged over the Egyptian backing of the revolutionary forces in Algeria, the French sat down with the British at a meeting in Paris. The top-secret gathering was attended by a special guest, Israel's envoy, Shimon Peres. France and Britain agreed that to curb Nasser, they needed to persuade Israel into launching a war on Egypt. They knew that it was Nasser who 1 year ago had banned all Israeli flights over and maritime travels in the Straits of Tiran, a fact which could be used to further provoke the Israelis into waging the war. The two managed to convince Peres, who quickly flew back to raise the secret proposal with Ben-Gurion, who did not hesitate to start working on it. The Israeli leader had no doubt that the new plan could change the situation on the ground. Nasser, who had felt in his bones the signs of an imminent conflict, decided to purchase American weapons, a request which was declined. Washington, London, and Paris all refused to sell arms to Cairo, as they had agreed in a 1950 pact to stop supplying weapons to the Middle East nations in a move to avoid an arms race in the region. Nasser now decided to shift towards the Eastern Bloc for financial and military assistance. Czechoslovakia agreed to do so. Egypt's increasing tendency towards the communists could further heighten the Cold War tensions. Eventually, on October 29, 1956, the Israelis invaded Egypt's Sinai Peninsula, occupying the area in 1 week. This was made possible with the French fighter jets covering Israeli ground troops against Egypt's mighty air force. But Israel had ignored the rules. It had angered the United States by forging a new alliance with France and Britain. Reacting, Washington put constant pressure on the UN Security Council for a temporary ceasefire. The Council was convened to put to vote the draft of a resolution which demanded Israel withdraw its forces for the purpose of a temporary truce. The resolution was, however, vetoed by both Britain and France. The Soviets proposed an alternative resolution which faced the same fate anyway. US President Dwight Eisenhower appeared before cameras to express Washington's open stance.
The United States was not consulted in any way about any phase of these actions, nor were we informed of them in advance. In the circumstances I have described, there will be no United States involvement in these present hostilities. I therefore have no plan to call the Congress in special session. Of course, we shall continue to keep in contact with congressional leaders of both parties. It is our hope and intent that this matter will be brought before the United Nations General Assembly. There, with no veto operating, the opinion of the world can be brought to bear in our quest for a just end to this tormenting problem. In the past, the United Nations has proved able to find a way to end bloodshed. We believe it can and that it will do so again.
Differences among the permanent members of the UN Security Council were not resolved, making the Council call on the General Assembly to hold an emergency meeting on the matter, where the majority voted for and ordered an immediate ceasefire. Britain and France, nonetheless, ignored the decision. Soviet Prime Minister Nikolai Bulganin, who saw the North African ally in jeopardy, issued an ultimatum to Britain and France, warning that if they failed to stop the aggression on Egyptian soil, he would raze London and Paris to the ground with the Russian atomic bombs. The day after, the war on Egypt was stopped. On November 14th, the first group of UN peacekeepers was stationed in the area, practically making Israeli forces pull out of the Sinai. The UN flag managed to keep the Israeli-Egyptian ceasefire holding for 10 years. The Israeli withdrawal benefited Nasser more than anyone else. The Egyptian leader was turning into the Arab world's unequaled idol. In May 1967, then Egyptian Parliament Speaker Mohammad Anwar Sadat visited Moscow for talks with Soviet Premier Alexei Kosygin. Sadat was secretly told that Israel had been amassing troops on the Syrian border. The Egyptian official was asked to relay the news to President Nasser, a man who was now the Arab world's hero after nationalizing the Suez Canal. The wicked secret revealing by the Russians was in a way aimed at provoking the Egyptians into a confrontation with the Israelis. The Soviet Union would be pleased to see a fresh conflict in the Middle East, as a result of which the regional competition between the West and the East would be affected, shifting the balance of power in favor of the communists.
Мы думали, что в политическом плане, даже если война закончится в ничью,
We believed a war could bring us political gains. Even a stalemate could bring us benefits. Egypt had our backing, both political and military. We thought their forces would demonstrate the benefits of Soviet support. So we were confident that the balance of power in the Middle East would be altered by a localized war.
Still, the Egyptian army detected no Israeli moves on the Syrian border. But the Russians insisted that the report was reliable. Nasser decided to stay vigilant and ordered his defense minister, General Abdul Hakim Amir, to put all troops on the alert and invade the Jewish state in case of an Israeli aggression on Syria. The Soviet plot to lay the ground for a new war in the Middle East seemed to have worked. Nasser wrote a letter to the United Nations, asking the world body to withdraw the international peacekeepers who had been deployed on the border with Israel after the nationalization of the Suez Canal, giving space to Egyptian boots there. The UN agreed to the demand. Now, all eyes were set on the Sharm el-Sheikh port. Egypt now seized the chance and once again closed down the Straits of Tiran in the Gulf of Aqaba, effectively disconnecting the Zionists' maritime links with the Eastern world. Indeed, the only route for oil shipments into Israel was now blocked, and this was but a declaration of war.
Our armed forces are ready for war. The Gulf of Aqaba belongs to Egypt. There is no way that we will allow Israeli ships to pass through. The Jews are threatening war. We tell them hello and welcome. We are ready for war. But there is no way we will give up our rights to the Gulf of Aqaba.
Israeli Chief of General Staff Yitzhak Rabin urged Foreign Minister Abba Eban to come up with a diplomatic solution for the crisis, because he believed Tel Aviv was not that prepared for a military confrontation. On May 25, 1967, Eban visited the United States to raise Israel's new predicament with American officials.
I've been asked by my government to explore what these governments intend to do in order to reopen this international waterway to a situation of law.
What do you want the United States to do, sir?
Well, I've come here really to find out what the United States intends to do.
US President Lyndon Johnson told Eban that Washington would not like Israel to be the initiator of the hostilities. During the meeting, Johnson revealed part of a classified document to Eban. The document said Israel would never be abandoned by the US unless it chooses to be so. The Soviets were whispering the same thing to the Egyptians and strongly recommended them not to initiate the war. But having closed the strategic Straits of Tiran, Cairo had practically done so. Inside defense meetings in Cairo, Egyptian generals warned that waiting for the war to be set off by Israel would cripple the Egyptian military. However, the chiefs of staff argued that letting Israelis start it would make Egypt face Israel only, while if it's waged by Egypt, then they would have to fight the Americans as well. May 30th, 1967. Meanwhile, Jordan's King Hussein met with Nasser to assure him that he still hated Israel as ever and that his government would relentlessly back Cairo in the event of a possible confrontation with Tel Aviv. The two sides inked a bilateral defense pact, with King Hussein technically bringing his army under the Egyptian command. Now, things became even more complicated for Israel. Egypt from the south, Jordan from the east, and Syria from the north were all getting prepared for invading the unwelcome neighbor. Prime Minister Levi Eshkol was in hot waters and had to find out whether the US could propose any solution for the reopening of the Strait of Tiran. The Americans, however, were already stuck in the Vietnam quagmire and couldn't afford to go through a new headache in the Middle East. Disappointed after receiving no helpful support from Washington, Eshkol decided to choose June the 5th as the starting day for an invasion of Egypt after being advised by his new defense minister, General Moshe Dayan. June the 5th, 1967. Starting at 7 a.m. sharp, with only 12 warplanes left at home, 180 Israeli fighter jets launched an invasion of Egypt. In 45 minutes, all runways in Egyptian air bases and military airports were heavily bombed, while Egyptian fighter jets on the ground were also hit by Israeli rockets. The surprise ambush gave the Egyptians no time, not even to start their planes' engines. The Egyptian Air Force was left in total ruins. The Syrian and Jordanian Air Forces also received their share of the damage. On the Sinai front line, however, Egypt statistically had the upper hand, with the number of its tanks 3 times greater than that of Israel. But those tanks were backed by no air cover. The Egyptians had no choice but to retreat. The order from General Amir's office was wired into the Sinai. But the army had no precise and scheduled plan for the retreat, with the troops rushing blindly back towards the Suez Canal. Israeli fighter jets seized the chance as best as possible, effectively cleaning the entire area of all Egyptian boots. The poorly planned retreat indeed broke the Egyptian army's back. The Israelis had told Jordan that in case it refrained from entering the conflict, it would remain unharmed. However, around 10:30 a.m. the same day, Jerusalem came under massive Jordanian artillery fire. But the Jordanian invasion also fell flat. The resistance by King Hussein's men in Jerusalem's Old City lasted less than 10 hours. Like the west bank of the Jordan River, the area which used to be under the king's control prior to the war now fell to Israeli occupation. After tackling Egypt and Jordan, Israel now had to deal with Syria. The Golan Heights at the Syrian-Israeli border came under the close scrutiny of Israeli army binoculars. After 12 hours of intense airstrikes, the Golan Heights too became another Israeli occupation. The Soviets, who had ignited the fresh battle by simply giving Egyptians a false alarm, now had to see their communist ally Syria under Israeli invasion. Thus, Moscow issued a warning to Washington that it planned to militarily support Damascus against Tel Aviv. That was not just an empty threat. The Soviet Union had already put Ukrainian fighter jets on the alert. June the 10th, 1967. Now, the US-Soviet Cold War was entering one of its most complicated stages ever. Inside the Situation Room at the White House, Johnson and his colleagues were deliberating a response to the Russian warning. In a letter to the Kremlin, the US president promised that he would do everything in his power to stop the Israeli war machine. However, instead of directly and officially raising the matter with the Israeli premier, Johnson only tasked the US envoy to the United Nations with discussing it with his Israeli counterpart. The US representative met the Israeli envoy at the lobby of the UN building to relay to him a serious message.
United States Ambassador Goldberg asked me to come out into the lobby and to say to me, you must immediately announce that the fighting is over.
But that was beyond the authority of Israel's UN representative, who only decided to share the message with Foreign Minister Abba Eban. Without wasting time, Eban immediately rang Prime Minister Eshkol's home to tell him that international pressure had built up and that Tel Aviv should bow to Washington's demand by an immediate pullout. But Eshkol, along with his army commanders, was enjoying the scenery of the Golan Heights. The Premier's wife relayed Eban's important message to him.
Eshkol, listen, Eban wants you to stop the war. He can't take the pressure. He said, I can't hear you. What do you mean you can't hear me? I'm telling you in Eban's exact words. He says, I can't hear you, I can't hear you. It's a bad line, it's a bad line.
But the Prime Minister acted as if he had not been informed and carried on with the incursion. Eban realized that Eshkol needed more time to further penetrate into Syrian soil, and that's what happened on the ground. After all the military objectives were reached in the Syria operation, the Israeli envoy in the United Nations was asked to read out the text of a draft resolution at the Security Council, something which would put an end to the war.
Israel accepts any proposal made by General Bull for the implementation of the Security Council ceasefire resolution and the arrangements for the supervision of the ceasefire.
Israel apparently offered peace, with a great bargaining chip and now large lands at its hands to exchange. It had already usurped the Golan Heights from Syria, the old city of Jerusalem, and the West Bank from Jordan, and the Sinai Peninsula and Gaza from Egypt. The Israelis said they were ready to hand back the Golan Heights to Syria and the Sinai to Egypt. But for such a peace plan, there was a condition. Arab nations must recognize Israel as a sovereign country. Eban traveled to the United States to table the proposal to the White House. However, the recognition of Israel was not something Gamal Abdel Nasser and the other Arab leaders would accept. Now, the Egyptian hero was stuck between a rock and a hard place. He would not recognize Israel for sure, but he was unable to stop Israel's war machine.
لقد قررت أن أتنحى تماما ونهائيا عن أي منصب رسمي وأي دور سياسي وأن أعود إلى صفوف الجماهير أؤدي واجبي معها كأي مواطن آخر.
He was now left with no choice but to step down. But streets of Cairo were immediately flocked with people who wanted nothing but Nasser's stay in power. The public was openly against the resignation. Nasser stayed, and he continued to resist the peace plan proposed by the US and the Soviet Union. September 1967, Arab leaders gathered in Khartoum, where they decided to say no to recognizing Israel and inking a peace pact with the Jewish state. Apparently, they were left with no other choice, and in response, Israel refused to hand them back the territories it had captured. September 28, 1970. Following an emergency meeting of the Arab League, President Nasser started to feel some pain in his chest. The same evening, Nasser's heart stopped beating before the eyes of his longtime friend and right-hand man, Vice President Anwar Sadat. Now, the incoming leader had much in his head for Egypt. The occupation of the Sinai by the Israelis had already entered a sixth year. Modern Egypt's third president was determined to take back the area which had fallen to the Zionists during the Six-Day War. Anwar Sadat lifted the rifle which Nasser had dropped. A new conflict was just in the making. Sadat began the game by turning to the Soviets. The Americans were backing Israel. Thus, the Egyptian president would have to resort to Washington's rival in the East Bloc. The Russians had a card in their sleeve for Egypt, which could change the entire calculations on the ground. The highly advanced surface-to-air missiles also known as SAM batteries, were definitely a huge challenge to Israeli fighter jets. Preparations were being made for the war which Sadat had long been aspiring for. Egypt's SAM missiles were now stationed on the banks of the Suez Canal, ready to explode any Israeli bird within a distance of 15 miles. Sadat was not alone in the war. His Syrian counterpart, Hafez Assad, stood by his side. The attack needed to be one of surprise, and the timing was therefore of pivotal importance. The day was chosen, and the strike was planned. Syria from the east and Egypt from the west. This time again, it was all about the Golan and the Sinai. Yom Kippur is a key religious holiday in the Jewish calendar, and known as the Day of Forgiveness of Sins. On this day, Jews flock synagogues and are busy worshipping all day. That was a fact Egypt was very much conscious about. October 6, 1973, when the Zionists were getting up to prepare for another Yom Kippur. The surprise attacks began from two different fronts: the Sinai and the Golan, the areas Israel had occupied during the Six-Day War. The first decision made inside Israel's defense ministry was flying fighter jets to curb the invasion. But the approval had to be given by only one person: the fourth Israeli premier, Golda Meir. But she rejected the idea, arguing that Israel had to gain increasing international backing following the Six-Day War, and for the same reason, now it should be seen as the victim of an aggression during Yom Kippur. The war continued. Egyptian commandos, backed by massive artillery fire, crossed the Suez Canal and stepped in the Sinai. At 4 p.m., the first Israeli fighter jets were authorized to enter the battle. But as they approached the canal, they were crushed by the SAM missiles. Now, Israeli tanks had to intervene, but the Egyptians had already planned a response. The close relationship with the Soviet Union came to the rescue again. Moscow had provided the Egyptian military with 83 Sagaranti tank missiles, making the Sinai a cemetery for Israeli tanks. In the first 36 hours of the battle, nearly half of the Israeli tanks stationed on the Sinai were completely destroyed. Around the same time, a new front had been opened in the north, in the Golan Heights. In a matter of 6 hours, the Israeli fire line was already broken, as Syrian tanks pushed ahead close to the Jordan River. The Syrians managed to retake the southern half of the Golan Heights on that very night. On the morning of October 8th, Israeli Chief of General Staff David Elazar announced that Israel had planned a counteroffensive.
This morning, we started our counterattack, and we shall break and destroy completely all the attacking forces.
But the Sinai Peninsula was witnessing a heavy Israeli defeat this time. Israel had to swallow the bitter pill, as it was unable to fight in both fronts in the west and the east. Elazar had to concentrate his forces on one of the front lines only. The Egyptians were fast advancing on the Sinai, but a long path of barren deserts was still to be trodden. The Syrians, who had already approached the Jordan River, were only kilometers away from Israeli border villages and towns. Therefore, Elazar preferred to focus on the Golan front. On the night of October 8th, Israeli tanks approached the positions of the advancing Syrian forces in the Golan Heights. But the infrared night vision equipment and weaponry which the Soviets had granted the Syrians dealt a massive blow to the Israeli army. The Israelis knew that a defeat in the Golan War would cost them too much. It could lead to Israel's total elimination. So they resorted to every means possible to keep resisting. On October 10th, the balance in the Golan began to shift as Israeli tanks pushed back the Syrians. Now, the Israelis were within a 30-kilometer distance of Damascus. To lift the pressure on Syria, Hafez Assad asked for help from his Egyptian counterpart. That's where Anwar Sadat took the decisive and fateful position. Sadat ordered his forces, who were stationed at the line of fire behind the SAM batteries, to relocate towards the nearby heights in the Sinai. But to do so, Egyptian tanks had to pass through a distance which was unprotected and not covered by those missiles. The move ignited one of the most intense battles of tanks in the history of armed conflicts. Enjoying a better strategic position, Israeli tanks started targeting the Egyptian ones, which were already out of the coverage of the SAM missiles, making themselves an easy and vulnerable target to Israeli airstrikes too. Some 260 Egyptian tanks were destroyed as a result, while the Israelis lost only 20. The war was entering the sensitive climax. Israel had fought back with poor equipment, and it was now beginning to get worn out. It was time for Meir's lobbying to pay off. From the very outset, following Israel's non-stop losses in the battle, the Israeli premier had begun pushing the Americans for immediate assistance. On October 16, 1973, history's largest military aid transfer, bound for Israel, took place under an order by President Richard Nixon. The massive flow of the military hardware boosted Israel's position and shifted the losses to its enemies.
There was no doubt in my mind, no doubt in Henry Kissinger's mind as to what we should do. Israel had to be saved.
With the entry of the American military aid, one of Israel's most professional veterans was called for service. The man who knew the Sinai Desert like the back of his hand, General Ariel Sharon. Sharon decided to open a pathway between the two Egyptian battalions which were in charge of protecting the eastern bank of the Suez Canal towards the western one, to let the Israeli troops pass through somewhere near the lake of Al-Murra. Due to the huge width of the lake, this part of the canal was not covered by the Egyptian forces. This had created a distance of about 1 mile between the two battalions. In fact, by crossing the pathway, the Israelis could put themselves behind the Egyptians. But something seemed to be not working. Sharon had underestimated the talent of the Egyptian troops stationed near the lake. The Israeli forces began the night operation to cross the lake. But since the Egyptians' power around the lake was beyond Sharon's calculations, the Israelis got stuck there after being engaged much earlier than expected, and only a small portion of them managed to successfully cross the waterway. But 1 year earlier, the Israelis, who had predicted such a battle, built the structure of a 180-meter-long bridge, which they could set up and use to cross the canal on this fateful day. They needed 3 days to install the bridge. On October 19th, they left the Egyptians in shock and disbelief by setting up the bridge. Having crossed it, the Israeli tanks took position right behind the Egyptian troops on the canal's western bank. Heavy artillery fire was opened upon the Egyptians, but the Israeli troops only had one target in mind: the propellers of the Russian-made missiles. Once the missiles were destroyed, the situation couldn't be better for the Israeli fighter jets to roam freely around and inundate all the Egyptian positions with an incessant flow of US-provided ammunition. The Israeli advance inside Egyptian soil had technically started. Sadat was left with no choice but a ceasefire deal. This is where Egypt's strong ally, the Soviet Union, had to intervene. Leonid Brezhnev, who had already shown his powers to rival Americans, called on Washington to agree to a joint stationing of Soviet and American peacekeepers in the area, or face it, because Moscow would land boots in the Middle East. The United States was almost certain that the Russians would not go ahead with such a deployment. Still, Washington decided to prepare its nuclear weapons. Thus, the fear of the two superpowers about a nuclear confrontation brought back calm to the Middle East, with a ceasefire deal reached on October 25th, leading the worn-out soldiers towards home. But there was something imminent which would have surprised not only the Israelis, but even Sadat himself. Left with no options, Sadat ignored the historical Arab fervor against Israel.
وستدهش إسرائيل إنما تسمعني الآن أقول أمامك أنني مستعد أن أذهب إلى بيتهم إلى الكنيسة ذات ومناقشتهم.
On November 19th, 1977, 4 years after the War of Yum Kippur, the fighter of the old days, Anwar Sadat, who was no longer able to keep on the battle, demonstrated a complete shift in policy. He became the first Arab leader to land in Israel's Ben Gurion airport after US mediation and support. Sadat addressed the Knesset with a speech themed around peace, reconciliation, and mutual understanding.
Let us agree that whatever happens between us, we should solve it together through talks rather than going to war.
But such a dialogue would need a cozy corner in Washington. The Northwestern Road, over the forest hills, where the private resort of the American president is located, Camp David. "12 days of secret talks at Camp David led to agreement on a deal which was 1 year later signed by the two sides at the White House, putting a smile of satisfaction on President Carter's face.
It provides for the full exercise of Egyptian sovereignty over the Sinai. It calls for the full withdrawal of Israeli forces from the Sinai. And after an interim withdrawal, which will be accomplished very quickly, the establishment of normal, peaceful relations between the two countries, including diplomatic relations.
Sadat had recognized an Israel which was once the red line for Gamal Abdel Nasser and the other Arab leaders who had openly announced at the Khartoum summit that there would be no negotiation, no peace, and no recognition. Still, Egypt managed to retake the Sinai with no bloodshed. Diplomatic ties between Israel and Egypt were established, and now Israeli vessels were able to freely and happily pass through the Suez Canal, the Gulf of Aqaba, and the Straits of Tiran. It all sounded like a good deal. And for that good deal, Sadat received the Nobel Peace Prize, becoming an international icon for peace. The Camp David Accords, however, had a sad ending for Sadat. 3 years later, in October 1981, the Nobel Prize winner was assassinated by a young officer who shouted, "Death to Pharaoh," as he emptied his rifle on the Egyptian leader. Khaled Islamboli, who said he represented the Egyptians and the other Arab nations opposed to the peace accords, took revenge on Sadat over reconciling with the Israelis.